Hello, my name is Jeff Farbman from the Wallace Center at Winrock International. Welcome to the National Good Food Network webinar, The $1 Million Question. What is break-even and viability for different food hub models? This webinar is not intended to give you the answer to this question with an unassailable magic number. Our hope is that by stepping through some models, you can get a sense for the rough magnitude of volume that different food hub models require to break even and then reach viability, and the impact of some of the business decisions you might make as you design and run your hub. Let me introduce you to the Wallace Center and the National Good Food Network. The Wallace Center, a business unit of Winrock International, is the host of the NGFN webinar series. The Wallace Center has been a leading organization in the movement for a more sustainable and equitable food system for over 30 years. Today, the center supports entrepreneurs and communities as they build a new 21st century food system that is healthier for people, the environment, and the economy. The center serves the growing business and philanthropic organizations involved in building a new good food system in the United States. In particular, we're focusing on advancing regional collaborative efforts around the country to move good food, healthy, green, fair, affordable food beyond the direct marketing realm into larger scale wholesale channels. The National Good Food Network, or NGFN, is an initiative of the Wallace Center. It is structured as a network of networks, ensuring efficient flow of information and innovation from boots-on-the-ground projects to the national level and back down to the grassroots level across the nation. The Wallace Center coordinates and supports the network. Our goals are to work with the growers to ensure that there is an abundant supply of good food to meet the high consumer demand for the product, to collect and disseminate the best models, stories, methods, and outcomes, and to ensure that policymakers are informed about the wonderful successes our network and partners have had so that we can continue to increase support for regional healthy food. You can learn more about the great work of the National Good Food Network on our website, ngfn.org. I'm going to introduce both panelists up front today, and again, let me reiterate that you should feel free to type in your questions as they occur to you. I have been encouraged by our panelists to interrupt them. Jim Barham is an agricultural economist for USDA's Rural Development Agency. Jim obtained an MA in cultural anthropology and a PhD in interdisciplinary ecology from the University of Florida. Before joining USDA, Jim worked extensively in the Middle East, Africa, and Caribbean with a number of nonprofit organizations and government agencies on agricultural development projects targeting smallholder producers. Jim joined USDA in 2007, where he has worked to improve marketing opportunities for small and mid-sized producers through a combination of research, technical assistance, and grant support. Jim has presented research and published a number of articles on regional food hubs, food value chains, local food distribution, and food service procurement. He is also currently on the management team of USDA's Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food initiative, a USDA-wide effort to support development of local and regional food systems. Jim Mattson serves as business advisor with expertise in local foods, primarily with feasibility, marketing, and business organization. Mr. Mattson has 25 years marketing, developing, researching, writing, and teaching experience in management for private, government, and nonprofit organizations. His experience includes working on local food projects throughout the U.S. and 20 foreign countries, including work with numerous food hubs throughout the U.S. for more than a decade. He was the lead author on The Role of Food Hubs in Local Food Marketing, USDA Rural Development Service Report 73, published in January 2013. He has owned and operated Mattson Consulting since 2001. The firm has assisted food-based business operations obtain millions of dollars in grant and lending financing. He holds an MS in agricultural economics. Jim, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for that introduction. And it's always good to be on a National Good Food Network webinar. And a shout out and thanks to all of you out there. I see there's over 200 folks that are attending this webinar, and we always appreciate your time and joining us for these webinars. And I want to give a personal shout out. I know that there's at least one viewing party at Clemson University with our friends at Greenville, and I'm sure there's some other folks as well. I'm not sure we call it a viewing party, but getting into financials is never usually a party. But anyway, in any case, glad to be on and for everyone to be part of this. Okay, let's see if we can get this slide. Here we go. Skipped one. All right, so let's just start with a quick presentation overview of our webinar today. I'm going to spend a few minutes just to kind of clarifying the Food Hub concepts. I think we're a fairly sophisticated audience these days, and the term has been around for a while, but it's always nice to get a quick refresher, at least from a USDA perspective when we talk about Food Hubs. What do we mean? And then something slightly different that I haven't really presented on because we've kind of been refining it ourselves is looking at and clarifying some of the different types of Food Hub operational models. And the main reason for doing this is that once Jim Mattson rolls into really digging into each of the financial models, we'll be differentiating these by different types of Food Hub structures, hence the reason I'm going to dig a little deeper into that. And then Jim's going to, after kind of laying out some of the financial models, go into some what I think is very cool scenario analysis. And then we'll wrap up with a few Food Hub resources and then hopefully have quite a bit of time to answer your questions. So Food Hubs, right? We've seen the term, we know the term. At the very core of it, we're talking about aggregation, distribution, marketing services from local producers to local marketplace. We have a definition that we use at USDA that I'm sure a lot of you are now familiar with, and it lays it out here. The idea is this active management of the supply chain, those activities that happen in the middle of the supply chain, those aggregation, distribution, marketing, in some cases processing activities of, and here's the key, those source identified that you actually know where the food is coming from and how it's grown and from and where and whom, and then it's going into these local marketplaces. So here's our little image of the Food Hub is one way of kind of displaying all the different activities that a Food Hub may do as part of their operations. In the middle part, if you look down the kind of checklist, these are kind of the core operational services that Food Hubs offer. And I'm going to come back to this idea of these core operational services because at the end of the day, what Jim Mattson and I both believe is that these types of services, as much as possible, should be self-funded by a Food Hub through their revenue they generate. At the same time, there's a lot of other services in many ways differentiate a Food Hub from other food distributors and the type of activities and services they offer to both producers as well as the community. And you can see a listing of those types of services that they often provide as well. There are a number of defining characteristics of Food Hubs. There's a couple I want to highlight. I know this is a busy slide, but the key points here that I want to get across is this idea that producers are a value business partner. And I bring this up because a couple webinars ago I was fortunate to be able to moderate a whole session on value chains. And one of the things that I want to get across today is the idea that a Food Hub is part of a value chain. In fact, all Food Hubs, as we define them, whether at the Wallace Center or at USDA or by others, is essential to at the heart of many food value chains. And part of that also is just their own mission. So Food Hubs, and if you look at the last point here, aims to be financially viable. Okay, there is a direct aim to do that, right? We all want to be financially viable, but they also have other positive economic, social, environmental impacts that they're hoping to make in their communities. So food value chains, and again, if we go back a couple webinars ago, we kind of laid out in probably excruciating detail more than you ever wanted to know about food value chains, but here is just the one slide shot that really talks about what really differentiates a food value chain from a supply chain. And here is this idea of intentionality, of structuring core operations that produce both financial success, okay, you still want to meet that financial bottom line, but you're coupling that as part of your core operations with a social benefit, which very much aligns with what we see with the Food Hub sector today. And part of that alliance is created through sharing both mission and operational values with the different supply chain actors. So the mission values, if you look in the internal part of the value chain, are things like we believe as a number of businesses in this supply chain in things like farm viability or farmland preservation or healthy food access or sustainable production. And then at the same time, there's a set of core operational values, things like accountability, transparency, open communication. These are the things that we see that are emblematic in food value chains. So how do we classify Food Hubs? When I first started this work 6 years ago and began to look at these, at the time calling them alternative distribution models, not a very sexy term, but that's what we had at the time, we actually our first classification was by legal structure. We were looking at some of these Food Hubs that were nonprofit, for-profit, cooperative Food Hub models, And that was one way of kind of classifying what they did. But really, as we dug in deeper and we began to see a whole new generation of food hubs emerge, the idea of classifying food hubs by legal structure is inadequate. The lines really, and as this slide is saying, are really blurring between what I like to call these socially driven for-profit enterprises and these business-savvy nonprofit enterprises. And if we've learned anything about kind of the success factors of food hubs, as well as the failure factors of food hubs, it has little to nothing to do with actually the legal structure. It has much more to do with how you manage it, how you manage cash flow, your relationship with producers, your marketing acumen, everything else. Whereas legal structure, And so I like to talk about form follows function. Figure out what your function is, and the form will follow that. So one way we think it's better to topologize or to categorize or classify, whatever word you want to use, food hubs, is by thinking about the markets they serve. And this is something that I have expressed before, which is looking at some of our data compiled by us in Wallace Center on the type of market channels food hubs use. And so there are food hubs that sell exclusively into the wholesale market, whether that be restaurants, hotels, grocery stores. You have it in that retail space at the wholesale price. And then there are some that are selling direct to consumer. And these can be your multi-farm CSAs, your buying clubs. There's a lot of grocery delivery that are focused on local. And there you have either, drop-off spots in a workplace, at home, in the community space. And then there's a number of food hubs that are doing both the wholesale as well as the direct consumer. And you can see it all kind of evenly breaks down here. A little bit more on the direct consumer, a little less on the wholesale, and then you have a little over 30% on the hybrid. So digging a little deeper in the operational models, on the wholesale food hub side, you have the kind of classic wholesale, a lot of them selling to restaurants, especially grocery stores. And then as you get into the institutional side of it, you have food hubs, sometimes exclusively, but oftentimes they're mixing different market channels where they may be selling both to schools and hospitals as well as to certain restaurants and grocery stores, cafes, what have you. Oftentimes they're either going direct to store delivery, literally to the store itself and dropping off on the back of the dock, or to, if it's a larger grocery chain and sometimes even larger restaurant chain, to their distribution centers. Now on the flip side, when we look at direct to consumer, we're looking at a market channel and market type that tends to be a little more on the fresh produce side, but not exclusively. We're seeing a lot more diversity in terms of the types of products that direct consumer food hubs are offering. We're seeing an increasing level of order customization, and what I mean by that is simply in the day where you would have maybe a multi-farm CSA and you would get the share and you got what you got, now there's a lot more opportunity to say, well, here's the basic share, but then I also want to add some honey. I want to add some other value-added products. And then in some cases, there's literally an online shopping experience where you can order completely a la carte. And then there's a lot of now options in terms of where you actually drop that off, whether you want it delivered directly to your house or in the community like I mentioned before. We do see more of a mix of the paid and volunteer. A lot of direct-to-consumer food hubs, I won't see a lot, but a fair share rely on a certain amount of volunteer labor in order to cover some of their costs, particularly at startup stage. And they are usually a higher margin. They're selling essentially at a retail price. The volumes are a bit lower than you would find, say, in the wholesale sector. And, of course, here are some examples that I mentioned before. And then the hybrid really is just a mix of those two models. One of the nice things about the hybrid model for food hubs is that if they have some larger producers they're working with, they can move a lot of their product into the wholesale market. And then if they have some smaller diversified specialty producers that are high demand, say in a restaurant or in a specialty grocery store, they can move that lower volume, get that higher margin. And so it does help in some cases to stabilize seasonal sales. They can work with a diverse host of different types of producers as well as market buyers. So here is, well, my favorite slide, and it's something I thought about, and I know that other people have talked about this before, this oxygen mask rule. And I happened to be on a flight to San Francisco, and I was going to give a talk at UC Berkeley about innovations in the food system. And of course, I'm a food hub junkie, so I was going to spend most of my time talking about food hubs. And it occurred to me that the oxygen mask is a wonderful rule for food hubs to follow. And it's essentially this, of course. Secure your own oxygen before assisting someone else, right? And when I talk about oxygen here, we're talking about your financial sustainability, your financial viability. try at most to work to figure out what you can do in order to sustain your own operations before you go way out there and you're helping everyone else in the world, right? And that's, there's another catchy term that people like to say is that there is no mission without a margin. And that's what really at the core of what we're going to get into talking about with the rest of the session. It doesn't mean that we don't feel there are services that food hubs are offering that shouldn't be subsidized, or that they can't have partners that are assisting you in order to meet your mission. But we also believe that those core operating functions of aggregation, distribution, and marketing of those local products, those local markets, that there should be a sense of trying to get at least to an operational break-even stage so that you really can meet your mission, those social, economic, environmental benefits that you really want to see accrue to your community. So with that, I want to say that this project and a lot of the research that came out of it on the financial models was a collaboration between Mattson Consulting, Jim Mattson and his wonderful crew down there in South Carolina, along with Virginia Fairs, which is a rural development, cooperative development center in Richmond that we work with. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Jim.
Well, good afternoon. I appreciate everybody coming on, more than 300 people during an NCAA basketball tournament day, though I'm sure some people are doing multitasking during the webinar at the same time as well. But what we've tried to do with this is try to set up to look at the models and where people are producing, but taking advantage to be able to step back from some of the day-to-day numbers that Food Hub are trying to create. And there's other studies out there that are wonderful on the benchmarking study, and where collaborative members of the Food Hub community have shared their data with Wallace and with Farm Credit as well of what's going. What we tried to do with this was to step back and try to look at different food hubs from a prototypical standpoint. And what that is in shorthand is we made up numbers. But we didn't just make up any numbers. We made them up based on kind of the reality of both our clients as well as lots of food hubs that were out there to say, what could they look like at different stages and what do their numbers look like? And I just want to take a minute to try to chat about a few of the basic, background assumptions that we have, since there's lots of food hub doing lots of different areas and lots of different regions of the country, and of course these numbers are going to be slightly different for each of these. So what we tried to look at for a food hub is saying that it's a hub that has a good variety of producers and members that are involved. They're not really set up with a constraint where they're super hard looking for members. More of a suburban type food hub where they are bringing it in from a rural area and selling into a suburban community or an ex-urban community with there. We also kind of set up for the wholesale food hub a little bit of a 6,500 square foot sort of warehouse facility as the general basis of what they're operating out of. When we're doing these numbers as well, we tried to step back, in most cases, try to get into a little bit more of the operational phase. Running on a product, sort of a variety of product mix, including predominantly produce, but also dairy products and some other products, including meat products, perhaps some other regional products within that were happening. So we didn't really specify the specific mix of products in any one week of the production or try down to that. We tried to look at just the general numbers that might be flowing through the food hub at that point in time with that. Then we set it up, and if you look kind of on the left-hand side here, from our operational models, these are the area that Jim Barham just went over. And the nice thing about doing a prototypical one is we were able to sort of make it pure on either side. So with our wholesale model, we were able to make sort of, in what we're saying, that all the sales are going to wholesale providers. And the same with direct-to-consumer model, that it's more of a CSA look and everything is running back through there. And the hybrid is a mix of those two again. And so, again, with our direct-to-consumer model, it's operating at a smaller scale level, and we'll talk about that in a little bit at each stage. But working through the fact that, the wholesale model at the period that we're getting into may be getting a few trucks, and they may be using a personal vehicle with mileage reimbursement at the direct-to-consumer one.
Jim, I have a question for you. I think it's a good one to bring in since we're talking about assumptions. One of the questions was, and I think it came because we have assumptions about how far the food hub is from customers, and there was a question about what was the assumptions about how far the growers were from the food hub.
We made the assumption for ours that the growers were responsible for getting the food to the food hub. So we put those costs outside of the core of the food hub with this.
Great. That's helpful. Thank you.
And part of it is we think those are going to vary or not. Just to give where some of our numbers in the background came from I had mentioned the Farm Credit Benchmark Study, and this one happens to be off the first version that I believe Michaela Fisher and Michigan State helped to put together from some of this data. But that basically the cost of goods was about 67%, cost of sales 11%. Most of you that are probably on the column have seen this before for gross margin 20%. And then that your labor costs were running for an FTE just under about $50,000 per full-time person. So just to give some of the background that our numbers are kind of in this range. And what I'd say is for ours is focus kind of on the ranges that we're talking about and not on any specific, detail of a number to the last digit, because I think the purpose of this is more to give an overview of what different hubs at different scales look like, and not really, to come back in here. And what we've done within our model and a little bit more is that we took kind of operational periods. And what we mean by this is we sort of picked break-even, growth, and then a viability period in the food hub's life. When we're talking about numbers within there, we're sort of taking a year-long snapshot of what's happening within that food hub. And again, with the idea of trying to highlight some common issues that happen at each stage, because there seems to be more similarity often in the stage of the food hub than there is sort of, across the time period they're organized. I'm going to go just explain a little bit of what these periods are. We're going to start, and I'm going to go through these in the conversation a little bit period by period within there. So start up is before you're operating. All that period, which everyone thinks is going to be 3 months, is often several years. Of what does it take on the cost for that? A little bit on the break-even, and the break-even is the period where you're covering your operating expenses, so you're able to pay your light bill, but you're not generating enough money to replace equipment or other things at that period. A growth period where it's sort of cash flow neutral throughout the whole of the year, and so you're generating enough money to cover depreciation, to cover the interest and payments on loans as well, but you don't have any money set back for growth or unexpected events. So you're ending up with zero or neutrality at the end of the year. And then what we're calling viability, or more I would think about sort of getting ready for the future, which if you're a for-profit hub is looking at about 5% return, or you're having a 5% to pull back in for other activities or to pay for other activities. And I want to hit again that as we're doing things, what we focused on with this report is only on the cash and the aggregation and distribution activities of the food hub. And by this is not to minimize the importance of any of the other wonderful and glorious activities that food hubs offer and community activities. We just wanted to try to take back with what would it take from sort of those core, is what we're calling it, core sort of sales activities to cover these other activities for food hubs. The other thing is by doing this with this period approach, it doesn't matter whether you're a for-profit or not-for-profit or organized in an LLC or a cooperative from the food hub itself. In fact, the only period at all that would have any difference is going to be in this viability period, because it's the only period where you're going to have any money left over to even deal with taxes. So I'm going to say that one again is from an operational standpoint, it doesn't matter whether you're a not-for-profit, a for-profit, an LLC, an individual owner, you're going to end up with basically the same operational functions by looking at it this way. And then you can add those other pieces on. So what we're trying to do is, strip the truck down, take off air conditioning, see what it would look like at that point in time. So we promised you numbers and our magic numbers, so I figured we'd start off with our magic number, and then later we can say why they're wrong or how they change. what we've looked at from a wholesale food hub, which again is sales for people that are going to be reselling the product, is that it takes about $1.2 million to get to that break-even period. So to be able to cover the lights and what's going on is about $1.2 million. And to get to that viability takes just about a doubling of that. And then at viability level, they have about a little bit more than 6 people on staff. On the direct-to-consumer one, because margins are better in some of the other things, costs are lower on some of the particular things, trucking operations, that's about 1.8 staff people. Now we do have included helping with some of these activities, some volunteer labor that may be helping with sorting or delivering of boxes, etc. The cost of that is not included in that break-even level, although a coordinator to help to coordinate that time is. So viability about 300,000, and break-even about 300,000, and viability about a little bit over 500,000 sales. And a hybrid, which is taking the combination of having wholesale and consumer sales coming in. So if you're in the wholesale market looking at adding some consumer sales, it's coming in with a slightly lower number for break-even sales, and then just a smidge lower on viability, because what we were finding is as you multiply, you save a little bit, but a lot of those costs end up coming in. A lot of groups are interested in the hybrid model because it may give you access to markets or ability to use producers that you might otherwise not be able to use within a food hub.
Jim, a couple quick questions. What is the value of the volunteer labor, or your rough estimate of the number of annual volunteer hours, particularly in the direct-to-consumer, since that seems to highly affect the number of FTEs?
In the direct-consumer, how we set it up was having a little bit more volunteer labor happening in the break-even and growth period, and that declining by viability within there. So by the time it's reaching viability, it's probably about 1 to 1.5 FTE within there.
Okay. And in fact, relying on volunteer labor
and it may be more expensive because we also have the cost of a volunteer coordinator in that proposal. So even though the volunteer labor is quote-unquote free, it's still costing you because of the organizational and coordination side in there. Now, we also did not include side with many food hubs would have for things like grant writing or community outreach as well. So we're just trying to keep that FTE staff time kind of into that more core activity level as well. I think if we weren't including those activities, it would be negative to include that staff as well.
I think there's some surprise that the hybrid model is so close to the wholesale model and not at all close to the direct-to-consumer model.
I think we did about 30% direct-to-consumer just of how we did our hybrid model. So it's a little bit stronger wholesale. But the cost function is once you start doing it, as you start getting larger, those numbers start coming in. In fact, I think I was the first person surprised with those numbers on it.
First person to see them, for sure.
The first person to see them. But the reason is that as you start adding the staff, and it basically, I think, if we look at that a little later as we go through some of the margins, et cetera, I think those numbers will make a little bit more sense.
Okay. And just one little piece. When we looked at the benchmarking data, it turns out that the split between wholesale, direct-to-consumer, and hybrid is kind of fuzzy. There are hubs that do 90% wholesale or 90% direct-to-consumer and 95%. So when the benchmarking study printed comes out, we sort of drew a line at 15%, and between 15 and 85%, that was the hybrid model.
That was the hybrid model. And like I said, I think in this one we have 30% direct-to-consumer and 70% wholesale to make ours.
Okay. Thanks.
Startup. And we're not going to do a lot of startup, and I think these numbers may also surprise some people when they see, I think some people are going to think they feel a little large on the cost of that. But these are the costs, but not only the capital cost at startup, but also some of that cost of time and other of staff during that period. Because what I found in my consulting experience is people do a decent job of looking at the hard cost, but don't think about the time that you have to go in and the permitting and the training, etc., that you have to have prior to opening, about getting that location cleaned up, ready to go, dealing with permitting and all that. We did processing here just to mention it because it is one area that gets mentioned frequently as an area that people go into. However, processing, as far as the cost it's going to be, comes in quite expensive on the equipment side, as well as some of the regulatory other things of doing more level. So this is the only time that we're really going into processing, because it's usually not, it's been found to be not the first position that most newer food hubs are going into within there. It's something that groups look at down the road, etc. So the direct-to-consumer setting up with that, and the wholesale looking at the equipment within what's going on. So 75,000 and 225,000 was our base for startup of how long it gets to get to that period. Then we sort of jump ahead a little bit to break even. And we haven't done things in a pure yearly basis with it. Somewhere in our mind when we were thinking about the model, we thought that break even may be 3 or 4 years down the road from startup. But there's not a specific period, time frame that we're saying getting to that. But again, break even is that time when you're able to cover, your cost of sales with everything, but you're not able to replace equipment or other items. So you're not covering depreciation. For those that are from an accounting basis, basically your EBITDA number is 0. So you're not covering unexpected cost or depreciation as well, or equipment. So once that truck that you're using breaks down, you don't have any money in the account to fix it. It's kind of what we've defined break even as. So it's a point to get to, but it's running to get to that first time. And what I'd like to say a little bit about, startup and going to break even. Startup, I think a little bit about has been before folks kind of have that first child. You spend all that time thinking about names, trying to figure out what it's going to be, what color you should paint in the nursery, etc. And then after the child is born, you call it by the dog's name, when you're trying to yell at them as the first name that comes out of you. So, break even is a little bit more in that operational period where you're dealing with your child and you're trying to, wrangle him down and figure out the problems and issues of what's happening on them. So break even is that first time. It's that first time you're beginning to catch up a little bit. You're going through, and again, this is based on totally operational costs, and that's the nice thing that you can do by making up numbers as opposed to looking at it. We have no grant dollars involved and no outside support other than, what may be a sort of a small amount of equity to keep the project going. So if you see on the top line, our revenue numbers are coming in, from where we said that break even was in our earlier chart. Now the interesting thing is on operating cost, and when you were looking at some of that cost figure about what you're paying producers and what it's costing to do on some of the hybrid versus wholesale, in the fact that from a hybrid model compared to a wholesale model, you actually may be incurring more costs because you're having to do drop-offs or smaller drop-offs and transportation and other things, as opposed to that wholesale model where you might be doing, larger stops or organize, your routes a little bit better at that point in time. But you're getting a very small margin in that level. By comparison, most of that money is going to producers within there. And the equipment cost, we kind of want to point out, although you have that larger equipment sitting there, what we're putting down for equipment cost is the cost of that loan for that, for that year, what that loan period is costing you. So for total equipment cost, it's the level for that year. So it's that loan and operation that's going. The same with facilities is how much are you paying for your lease of what's going on in that level. And then for selling and marketing, that's your staff level and what's going in within there. So that's just your level of staff that's working on your sales level and production stuff. And G&A, the administrative level, is your staff. Your online staff and what's happening. That's not directly on your payments per producer in that level. And contingencies because, you know, things go bad. You have to do refunds. You have to deal with other things in that process. So that's where we're trying to look at on the unforeseen and contingency, is trying to deal with, you know, the percentage of product that's going to have to be refunded or can't be sold for whatever reason.
There's a comment that $5,000 on $1.2 million seems like a very small selling and marketing budget.
Because we're assuming with these that at this level you're going to be doing very little, you know, for marketing and promotion. That most of your marketing is going to be done via your staff, your drivers, etc. And we're trying to take, I should have said a little bit on this, and that's a good point to bring it in. What we were trying to look at is kind of at what level could you get to trying to make things as small as possible in most cases. So the selling and marketing cost is just things that are promoted directly to promotional activities. So not staffing. All your staffing is under that general and administrative expenses. So your sales and marketing manager and those levels aren't included in that 5,000. So that is literally just marketing and promotional activities. And what we're finding is most groups aren't spending very much on marketing at the break-even level, that they've been trying to, you know, pay back their bills on a day-to-day basis. Now, whether they should be spending more, that's a, you know, that's a discussion for looking at that. If that's a good use of money, I think that's a good discussion with there.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
So, and I think that was one of the things coming out of there on break even. You know, people went scrambling to get to those stages. Almost all your cost, if you look at it, and I'm going to slide back and forth a couple of times to this slide. I apologize a bit for that. But most of your cost, if you look at it, are going to, by far, you know, paying back your producers for your product and delivering that product, you know, to whatever location you're getting to. That's by far your biggest piece you're dealing with, and we're going to go and show a couple of graphics later about where that comes from. But, you know, so not leaving a whole lot left over, you know, even for small areas like equipment or facilities once you're trying to get to that. So it's trying to run pretty thin with there. And then going from the break-even to the growth level, and the growth level is where what we're defining it as is basically where net income is sort of zero on your P&L, and you're covering, you know, your total expenses of all your loans. So you have enough money to cover both the interest on your loans as well as make a capital payment on them, and then you have money for depreciation and normal breakage of things, so you're able to have a little bit of contingency funding setback, basically at a straight line depreciation level is what we did within there. So looking at this level, you know, not shockingly, it's larger than the sales level. We still have kept marketing pretty low in this period. Now, whether that growth period is realistic, being, you know, small on marketing cost, but again, we're feeling like most of these expenses for marketing are coming via, you know, personal contact. So your drivers, your salespeople, your farm coordinator. We also do have under, and we probably should have put a slide in here, but we also are including positions for drivers, for farm coordinator, who's helping to coordinate and pass information back and forth to your farmers on a normal basis, for whether that's training or coordination within there. And again, you know, kind of getting that increase happening on the variable margin of what are we looking like within there. Interest expenses come in, and now you're able to cover sort of your, you know, your interest and your viability as those levels are coming along. You know, and why we have some of these dollars here for the net income figure to cover that. Once you cover, and these numbers are off the profit and loss statement, once you cover the capital side of the loan, that takes away most of that net income figure. So most of those dollars end up paying the, you know, not only the interest side of the loan, but also the capital side of the loan, and those just don't get included, you know, just under accounting rules, under the P&L statement usually. Getting to that step level is what we're trying to look at a little bit, is, you know, how is it happening for break even from a wholesale model? What are we looking at the period? What is happening with cash flow on this one? So there's an interesting thing that happens, particularly in the wholesale model, which is that groups, although they're growing, they often run into a cash flow crisis during this period and actually have to borrow more money, because we have set up there an average payback period of 21 days for the wholesale buyers, which means that when you're getting to your largest month of sales, you notice this lag of cash flow behind it. So as your sales are increasing, which is the yellow line, those are your months actually of lowest cash on hand, because you're having to pay your producers and you're having to pay your bills for staff and operation, but you haven't been paid back yet for your product. So one of the issues that comes in during this growth period is the importance of managing cash flow. It's not much of an issue during the break-even period or due to that time, because you're behind always in that period. But as you begin to grow, that cash flow management skill becomes a larger and larger piece of being able to be viable, because again, although you're growing, if you end up at this point and don't have enough money to pay your staff back, you can grow yourself right out of business. So that is one that comes in.
And practically that looks like short-term lines of credit?
Exactly. So you're coming in short-term lines of credit, which come in at a slightly higher cost perhaps. Or again, this could be a level where you can get community sponsorship helping you to, cover some of that, short flow from a cash flow basis level. Mm-hmm. Now, we've put this in the model with a short-term loan in it, but an operational loan. So coming out of that with growth, growth again is that period where things are getting better, sales are increasing. And again, it's easy for us on a computer model to increase the numbers and say you're going to do this level of sales. If you're doing a CSA model, although we're putting it up, and I'm going to slide up two slides real fast. If you're doing a direct-to-consumer model, going from that $350,000 to $400,000 of revenue, it's very easy for me in a model to change it. It may be a lot harder in reality to find those consumers. And again, you're talking about a total increase of consumers. Well, you may have folks that are declining to want to renew their baskets or other things. So like I said, although we're talking and able to put this in here, it may be harder to find with customers as you trade customers, as you're doing other things with those customers in there. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's easy to do magic on the model, financial model. Sometimes it's a lot harder in reality to find that next consumer, which is why a lot of times it seems like as folks go from growth to viability, one of the things that a lot of groups seem to tend to do in reality is add more. If they started as a direct-to-consumer food hub, they begin to look for some wholesale businesses, or they get large enough that wholesale businesses begin to approach them as a particular area. Vice versa for food hubs that are wholesale-oriented. At this time, even though that may be their main focus, they begin to like those higher margins that often happen, or sometimes less pickier on certifications that may happen with a consumer side as opposed to a wholesale market within there. So looking at that on viability, like I said, for us, viability was having a net income figure of about 5%.
Jim, before you get into this particular slide of viability, I know there's been several comments kind of questioning the costs associated with labor and thinking that perhaps these costs are too low. And can you help explain kind of labor costs?
What we ran is we actually used the labor survey data from consumer surveys and from the job positions actually that were coming out of there from Department of Commerce. So we used those as our average numbers. I believe we came in based on that position with there, as well as in talking. So since they're average figures, I think if you're, perhaps in, the deep south where labor numbers are lower, these may be slightly higher. I think they're obviously lower than California numbers. We actually do a scenario later where we vary our hourly labor rates and sort of talk about that.
Right. Yeah, that'll be very interesting.
So I think that one will come up a little bit later. But like I said, I think we ran the labor numbers through kind of sort of what numbers we're running, based on sort of, industry standards with that. And obviously I think people could pay more with ours, than what you're running.
The benchmarking study did look at the price of labor, not really the cost of labor, but the percentage of dollars that went into labor in different regions of the country, and it did show some variation.
And our numbers track pretty well with the benchmarking study numbers overall, with both FTEs and general labor costs. So I think individual groups do. And we also took a little bit when we were doing numbers for the earlier years, was assigning sort of a role-based model. So we may have a manager in hourly labor where the manager may be half-time, but some of that time would then, you'd have other time that they'd be working, helping on the staffing and supply and truck driving, et cetera, because that seemed to be more how food hubs are actually operating. You may have slightly less people from an FTE position doing many different labor roles throughout the year. And labor, I think, is definitely an issue, particularly at the smaller level, is, not as much as paying for labor, but being able to maintain labor if you don't have the product, available throughout the whole year, of keeping good staff people, and particularly after you've trained staff people, et cetera, keeping them around for the next cycle if you're closed for several months over the winter or during your non-peak period.
Well, all the labor is under G&A, right? It's the total variable cost there, that's cost of goods sold.
We've got a little bit of variable and operating coming under, some trucking expenses under total labor operating cost, and the rest of it is under G&A with that level.
Okay.
So there's a little bit under variable operating cost, but most of it's under G&A within there. And again, what we were trying to do is look at, from a point of how skinny could you kind of operate and make this happen. So we're definitely not trying to add extra labor and put in that labor for the social missions or other activities. So I think, hubs in practice may have more labor that are out there doing it than what it's showing. I mean, for us, kind of looking at where it's setting is saying sort of where does that come in, and that $2.5 million level for revenues, and the direct-to-consumer model coming in at again that a little bit over $500,000 of sales, which is a lot of baskets. If you're at $30 a basket is a lot of baskets coming in for a smaller suburban exurban area running around with that. The hybrid, again, sort of why some of those numbers came in, although you still have enough space on that at the viability level for the 6,500 square foot facility, you're sort of, beginning to use most of that facility. You don't have really any extra space by the time you've reached this viability period. You're sort of crowding in the walls and probably using your loading dock, et cetera, for activities as you're running through it. So you end up with some inefficiency in labors, and we've kept things, again, fairly cheap as far as we could do with equipment and facilities on an annual basis, just sort of letting it grow, with a small cost with that period. And then the most interesting thing for us isn't really these numbers, but what happens once you start kicking them? And how do they change? How do they matter? As you start looking at these numbers, how do they impact, what's going to happen with the food hub overall? That is sort of the best place to try to figure out, what's the difference, what happens with the model, but also what are the points of things. And the first one we wanted to put in of trying to get these numbers is to sort of look at, what happens. And for a lot of these examples, we've used the wholesale example. It's the same for the other models, basically the same percentages of the other models, but how important it can be to get this outside funding or grant funding. So if you look at getting to break even on the wholesale period, it goes from that $1.2 million down to less than $1 million if you can get $500,000 of grant money or community funding.
$50,000, right?
$50,000, excuse me. Thank you. So how that number is dropping pretty precipitously and that, if you can get people to put in $150,000 from the community, you can get to that break even at 150, with $150,000 and, $500,000 of sales. So the importance that community can have in getting that, group funding or other activities can have a big level. Back to sort of that decision point, I said at the beginning that it really didn't matter from operations whether you are for-profit or not for-profit, but it may help to drive one of these decisions. If you can find, angel funders that are willing to fund you, it may be a way to help you get to that break-even point quicker. Again, at some point in time, though, in most cases, funders get donor fatigue and wander on to the next project.
So just to put a finer point on it, that's $50,000 per year every year.
That's $50,000 per year, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So coming up with that. So if it took you, 5 years to get to break even, you needed $50,000 every year to get there. So you didn't incur that extra debt.
Yep. Okay.
So so yeah, it's keeping yourself on the oxygen supply basically, but it can make a big impact of getting for points, etc. With it. However, on the opposite side, and people were talking about labor costs, otherwise, if your costs go up, so if our labor numbers were off. And let's say if you needed another $50,000 of labor to throw that in our model, suddenly, as opposed to needing $1.2 million to break even, you need about $1.5 million. So let's assume you're in a higher cost area, or we just were we were a little bit too harsh in assuming labor is going to be too efficient. And so suddenly just $50,000 extra of labor, so that's basically one extra position. One extra FTE at break even means $300,000 extra of sales, or almost $300,000 extra of sales. And if you end up with a couple of positions and a couple costs at $150,000, suddenly that break even goes from 1.2 to 1.95 million. So again, because most of your dollars, 70% of your dollars, and we're going to get into this as sort of what drives this. In this next slide, and Jim had his oxygen slide, me being a geek, I want numbers and other things, but when you get down to expenses, the driver is how much money you're paying your producers. That really is what ends up driving these costs and how it, why your margins, vary so much with having extra money or extra cost other side. So if you're only having that, 30% left over for all your other expenses, it doesn't give you a lot of room to move with, or a lot of room to fuss over different activities to try to decide what's happening, how do they work, what are you doing, and you notice again we have this marketing cost in here as a very small sliver, at the end of the day, even of your other expenses. Now how does that look, and how does it look in the model if you change those numbers to producers with that being your largest, your largest cost? Now we have our payment to producers being 70% in the wholesale model with that. It drops actually in the retail model. In our direct-to-consumer model, we're running about a 55% payment to producers. So it's, but it works the same way as this with here. So if you drop your payment to producers, which is not what most food hubs come in the door wanting to do with the community aspect, to 65%, a 5% decrease to producers, suddenly you get a 23% decrease in what you have to sell to break even. But if you increase that to 75% or 80%, see how those numbers go. And actually above 80%, we tried 85% payment to producers, and it broke the model. And I know a lot. So I know a lot of food hubs come in the door, folks interested in organizing food hubs come in the door saying, well, we're going to, part of our community emphasis is we're going to pay, our producers, and going from a 70% average payment to producers to an 80% average payment to producers, makes a huge difference in that break-even point of the hub, or the, the break-even sales point. And this, again, isn't even covering, equipment that breaks or other things. So maybe if you're coming in with a too high payment to producer at the beginning, you just don't generate enough, extra revenue to cover your operating cost, even running pretty thin on staff and other things. So that was one of the things that sort of popped out as a big interest and a big driver to us of this model is, I would encourage folks, no matter how you're organized, to think long and hard about that payment figure and how you need to do it and other ways to manage it.
Do we have a, sorry, Jim, do we have a comparison for the standard, the sort of industry standard for payment to producers by, your standard produce distributor?
It's about 50% on average. And I pulled that number and forgot to write it down with me. But it's often about 50%.
Okay, thanks.
Labor cost. So we ran sort of where you're going to be with extra, and we ran a slightly lower than an FTE, but it made a nice round figure. But where do you end up with these extra labor costs? Because we also were questioning, sort of at that level or different cost levels. So where do you end up with labor? So if you just increase labor at that same level of sales, again, that $40,000 increase of labor takes you to that 1.4 million to 1.2 million. So if you're running, that extra $40,000 of people, where that takes you in those numbers on, at break even. And the same thing follows all the way through. We're just running break even because we don't want to put people immediately to sleep. I'm running through all the numbers with each point. So if you think about that extra, $40,000 in labor sort of brings you to about $165,000 of labor costs as opposed to the $125,000 that we have in the original model. But you can see how that kind of moves along on the margin on that. So again, labor is a key driver, and it's one of the things that after producer costs that varies the most, directly on food hub sites that you can vary. Another thing that we kind of wanted to drop in, and this sort of gets us on the wholesale, how much does it cost to carry extra equipment? What are we looking at? What does that cost on the loan payment, and what is the total cost to get there? So for ours, if you see here, we sort of ran, and you see we have a mix of several different loans within there that runs kind of from a 60% of the cost of that piece of equipment up to 75% of the cost of that equipment being financed, and with finance charges being about 6.5 to 7%, and we've included in our percentages all the fees, so any sort of origination fee that may be, any sort of cost of paperwork, any sort of other levels. So if our interest rates seem a little bit higher than may be seen for the the loan rates, that's the reason why. And then terms sort of a spread from 6 to 10 years, which seems to be kind of the average equipment cost that we were finding, industry-wide. So it's a mix of about 3 or 4 loans in there, just to give us our background of how we assumed it. But what we wanted to get down to is to kind of talk about, at what level sales do we need to get to change that. So the interesting thing is going from a growth at the, looking at it from a net income level, how much more do we need to grow our net income to pay for that equipment? Where are we looking at for our baseline figure? So what's happening effectively is $50,000 of equipment, increase your annual loan fee, just over $4,000. So it costs you, on a per year basis, that equipment is costing you $4,000 more in loans. So that's the direct cost of getting $50,000 more of equipment, and up to the $150,000, running this sort of blended equipment, is costing you another, $12,500 for the loan. So you can get, $150,000 more of equipment, and it costs you more. And part of why we wanted to put that in is, in our experience working with groups, a lot of folks go out and maybe try to buy secondhand or used equipment that may not be in good conditions, or they try to do without equipment and maybe substitute labor and other things for that equipment. And the nice thing about it, equipment within this is if you can get the loan, and that may be the harder piece, if you can get the loan, the actual cost to it on a yearly basis may not be, as much as you would expect because of the carrying cost of that loan.
Jim, there was a question about what type of equipments are you assuming in this example? Like what kind of equipment would?
We were thinking maybe extra coolers,
yeah,
extra level, but I think for the loan it could also run, although it's a little long in the finance period, from trucking, etc., could fall back in there.
And the main takeaway here really is there's not a lot of value in trying to go cheap on equipment.
Being cheap may be really expensive.
Right.
So if you end up not being able to make a delivery or having higher losses on a product level because you put in a used, a used compressor and it blows out on that 105-degree day in the middle of July, it may have been really expensive, cheap solution. So the question is can you get, that? It also may be from groups that are looking from a social capital side of trying to look for people that will give them loans, maybe an area where they may have more difficulty finding a loan through traditional means, looking for some of their, community partners as opposed to a grant coming in for a loan may be a way to help to, leverage the activities that are happening as well. Then from what our piece came of looking with this, and definitely, throw some things open from some questions is, what we're seeing from the models is not a shock that food hubs can be a viable entity, a viable model that can look there. Most hubs looking at it, we were sort of surprised that, the hybrid model ended up costing not a whole lot less than the wholesale model and what we're talking about due to sort of inefficiencies on labors, etc., for the activities don't necessarily overlap as well as you would expect with that. But there are in a range that can work for rural areas and smaller areas with that. If you think that, the average McDonald's runs, in the range of break even for the wholesale model is what one McDonald's runs on a yearly basis of gross sales. So from a community standpoint, there aren't a whole lot of communities that aren't supporting, enough business to run a McDonald's. So they are running in that level. Again, the details matter, and small changes in payments to producers, small changes in payments to staff can make a big difference. And we didn't vary, but the same thing would happen on the same thing about, break-even costs or loss numbers for the viability of your, contingencies numbers as well. If you end up wasting a lot of product because you can't sell it, that would do the same thing to the numbers as these additional charges, as well as the importance that community support can have in reducing how much that can be. However, in the long term, you kind of need to get to that viability number, or at least a growth number. If you can find long-term partners to come in who are willing to continue to support that growth and help to show what's coming in, and serve as a backup for contingency or future growth, that also can matter. And with that, I would, open it back up, for Jim Barham to kind of comment and sort of, summarize my ramblings a little bit here.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think, working with Jim on this and some of the highlights and kind of top line stuff that I've taken away is one is payment to producers and how much that means in terms of the overall model and reaching your operational break even. And it's a very difficult situation where many food hubs, part of their mission is ensuring the greatest amount of revenue goes back to producers. Hence, the reason that the producers want to work with food hubs versus a traditional distributor. Now, I think the numbers are that 50% is probably a little on the low side. I think it's actually the industry numbers of COGS is higher than that. But that being said, the impact that has on the overall model is really just mind-boggling. At the same time, and I think this is really, the idea that small changes matter. They do matter extremely. They're extremely important in terms of payments to producers. What ultimately is that right balancing act? At the same time, not scrimping on equipment that ultimately can really puts you in a bad situation when, you know, taking that loan and financing over a period of time is negligible to the overall operational break-even of your business. There was a couple questions that came in. One of them is not specific to the model, but it's highlighted within the model, and it has to do with what does Food Hubs say about impact they have in the community in terms of workforce development and job creation. And something to keep in mind, you know, a food hub, even a very successful food hub, is a pretty lean operation, and if they're planning to be around for a while. And the benefits that accrue to a community is not through direct job growth by funding this particular business. It is only going to, you know, employ 5 to 7, maybe 10 people if it's a fairly large operation, and many less than that. The real benefits accrue to the amount of revenue generated by producers and the indirect and induced effects of that to the community, in which food hubs on average run between 40 to 60 producers, work with 40 to 60 producers, and you think about the impact of that additional revenue on farm, on labor, on inputs, that's where the impact. And then of course on the consumer side, with the increase of local healthy fresh food into communities, we certainly see the benefits accrue there as well. So I just wanted to throw that in there. I've got a few more slides I want to run through, and then maybe we'll kind of loop back around and try to answer some of the other specific questions people had. Let's see if I have control, and I should. Okay, just real briefly, I wanted to highlight some of the resources that exist out there, if you may or may not be aware of them. Jim Mattson was the primary author on that third one there on the role of food hubs and local food marketing, and myself, as well as some Wallace Center folks, were involved in some of these earlier publications, all dealing with food distribution. There's a new report, a relatively new report we put on food value chains, everything you ever wanted to know about food value chains but were afraid to ask, so something worth checking out. And then there was several questions on this, so I'll get right into this. One of the things that we're doing with Jim Mattson and his associates is developing a USDA Food Hub Technical Report series that will be published by the agency I work with, Rural Development. One of them is actually in the layout process and will be out shortly. It's called Running a Food Hub, Lessons Learned from the Field. More of a qualitative look at what's working and what isn't working, kind of a set of good practices that food hubs have adopted. That'll be the first publication that comes out. The second will be on Business Operations Guide, kind of a how-to run a food hub. And then the third, which is specific to the topic at hand, is assessing financial viability of food hubs, which we're going to be taking a lot of the data. And actually, I'd like to say thank you for the tons of questions and very critical questions and looks at saying, some of you are saying this just doesn't pan out. I know that, you know, our costs are this or this, and that'll give us a lot of fodder for us to look at the model and see how we can hopefully make it even more robust than it is. But in any case, the intent is to put out a publication that will not just have the numbers, but explain a lot of the assumptions and break this all down in a lot more detail for those of you who care to see that kind of detail. So look for that in the summer, most likely that last one on assessing financial viability.
Is the intent to provide the Excel model?
So we're in conversations. We can't give away the keys to the kingdom of Mattson Consulting. These are pretty sophisticated models. At the end of the day, we have been talking about a stripped-down version that would still be helpful for folks so that they could plug in their own numbers. So we'll keep you. We hope to maybe get something in place, but to be decided or to be determined. But we certainly see the value of it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then we do have several websites, including USDA's as well as the Wallace Center, with plenty of resources there. You know, things like the Food Hub benchmarking study from Farm Credit, as well as Food Hub national surveys from Michigan State University are there. I want to say one other thing, and this actually gets back to one question that someone asked, and it was earlier in the presentation, was do we actually know nationally how many food hubs are in the break-even, how many are in the growth, and how many are in actually viability? And while we don't have a complete answer for you, we do have a partial answer. And one of the things we asked in the original last year's National Food Hub Survey was how many food hubs were dependent on any external funding to carry out the core functions of aggregation, distributing, and marketing local food products. And 51% said they had no no external funding. Now, that doesn't mean they're operational break-even. They could be slugging it along, but it does give you a sense that about half of the food hubs out there are on their way toward probably operational break-even or are actually already at it. Again, I think we're hoping there's a new national survey that will actually be coming out fairly soon. So for those food hubs out there, keep your eyes and ears open. There'll be more announcement from Michigan State University and the Wallace Center about this survey. And we hope to get some better numbers through that data that we collect. And then I think, yeah, just one last slide here. For those you're not aware, I sit on the management team of Know Your Farm and Know Your Food Initiative. It's USDA's department-wide effort to support the development of local regional food systems. We have a very cool website that lists all the resources available at USDA. And there is also a very neat compass map, which is being updated April 1st and will include all of USDA's local food investments from 2009 to 2014, including other federal agencies like Commerce and CDC and Health and Human Services and Treasury's investments in local food projects as well. It allows you to search through that and find a lot of different ways of connecting with other people in your community doing this type of good work. And we thank you. And we have a good 15 minutes or so left. So, Jeff, maybe there's a couple aggregated questions that you want us to try to cover?
Yeah, sure. Well, one question is, it's not aggregated. Do you know if any CDFIs have financed food hubs? We talked about access to capital being a critical point.
There has been. And probably the best example out there is the TRF, the Reinvestment Fund, based in Philadelphia, and their support, particularly in the early stages with Common Market, a food hub there. And the key piece there, and a key piece where a lot of CDFIs can and have played a role, is helping food hubs acquire a line of credit. So you had Jim Mattson talk about cash flow difficulties when you're selling a lot of product and producers expect to get paid, but you have a net 21 and people, the buyers are taking longer to get back, and all of a sudden you're really in a bind. Getting a line of credit, a low-interest line of credit, is key. And CDFIs like the Reinvestment Fund have been in that space doing that, which has been hugely helpful. There's other folks like RSF Social Finance, not necessarily CDFI, but a nonprofit financial institution that has also been very instrumental in this space in helping folks to acquire those lines of credit, as well as even getting capital investments for infrastructure.
Great. I'm going to launch a quick little poll here. Feel free to just vote here as we go through another couple questions. But this is just a question: if you'd like to be on a mailing list to be notified when the Food Hub Technical Report series that Jim mentioned is available. So go ahead and let us know. There are a couple questions on why the facilities costs are so much lower for the hybrid versus the wholesale models. Any insight there?
Muted.
What we looked at with that one is just where it was the starting point on that one. So we were just doing some extra.
Unmuted.
That it may be starting with a lower cost per square foot of coming in with a larger facility to begin with, and perhaps capturing a lower cost per square foot on that.
Okay, great. How would operational costs look different if serving in a rural area?
I suspect you'd be spending a lot more money on transportation, of trying to drive more, and so your labor and delivery cost of that, above the line level would go up on that. And you may have less efficient routes. So I think we were doing an average route of about 50 miles in our model. Obviously, if you're, in Montana, that may go up significantly.
Right. There was a comment that incorporation status, whether not-for-profit or for-profit, doesn't really matter. However, your vivid example of getting $50,000 a year in free money seems to fit best with the not-for-profit model. So how are for-profit hubs capitalizing themselves?
That could be equity financing as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But that could be equity financing at that stage as well. So that's why we didn't want to prejudice with that on it.
Sure, sure. Okay.
But there's a good point there, Jeff, and that there is, there are certain advantages and disadvantages of running a food hub as a nonprofit versus a for-profit, or as a cooperative for that matter. We know that in the cooperative food hub model, the whole basis of the development startup is based a lot of times on member equity, and be able to get that immediate equity based on the commitment of a number of members of the cooperative. That's a great advantage. At the same time, nonprofit as well as cooperative models sometimes struggle more than the for-profit in being able to approach a traditional financial institution and get a line of credit. That's where some of the CDFIs and other nonprofit financial institutions have been able to step in to help fund some of these nonprofits. But quite honestly, for a lot of these startup food hubs, even if you're for-profit or nonprofit, traditional financial institutions don't look at you as a viable operation to begin with. Something that you're usually the risk profile is too high anyway. So some of these things do kind of wash out. Go ahead, Jim.
And we do think there's some differences. I don't want to overstate that there's no differences between them. What we're trying to focus on more on the operational piece, because there definitely can be differences in both missions and the ability to raise funds. For example, a co-op could use retained earnings as a way to kind of come in, or pay on a pool basis much easier with a marketing agreement and not have quite as big of a, that cash flow delay as well. So there definitely can be some operations. We just try to want to simplify it a little bit, because again, if we try to do in every nuance that every food hub is doing, we'd still be grinding this through about to the year 3000.
Sure. Ted is impressed with the narrow margins, and he asks, how can a food hub serve low-income communities looking at that triple bottom line who often can't afford to pay the higher costs from producers? Any innovative models you've seen there, Jim?
Well, I think there's kind of a mixed portfolio of high margin to low margin market channels that food hubs are utilizing, in which they're actually taking a loss on some low margin in order to satisfy the mission, and then hopefully recouping those losses through high margin. And getting out of my tech speak, just simply, a white tablecloth restaurant is going to have a nice margin for you that maybe allow you to enter into a school district and sell at cost or even below cost, and then recoup that by selling at a high-end grocery store and restaurant. And I think you have to be realistic about that. I don't think there's many food hub models out there right now that can exist exclusively on, say, institutional sales to, say, schools, where the margin is so narrow. You have to kind of branch out, even if it isn't part of your mission to feed the wealthy. The wealthy will pay more, and that should be factored into your model in terms of being able to satisfy your mission. So that's kind of where I stand on that.
And part of why we wanted to put those extra costs in and show the extra cost is that may be a way that you can go to a funder and say, look, this group can pay X percentage less. Here's what we're going to need to help to cover them. And if you see with the leverage factor and some of that multiplication factor in the community, again, a small investment from a community organization may be a way to help to be able to serve a group that could have a higher cost.
Okay, David asks, assuming a stable or slightly expanding population and food hub's commitment to really source and sell locally, as hubs grow, who's not getting the sale, right? Where there are only so many mouths to feed and only so much food volume. Who's losing as hubs grow?
I can tell you who's losing. I mean, your traditional distributors are losing to a certain degree. We did a study, and if you're interested in this, Cornell, funded through USDA, did a really nice study looking at the impact of a particular food hub in upstate New York, and actually in Ithaca, New York, called Regional Access. And they not only were putting together a kind of input-output model in order to see what kind of multiplier effect the food hub has, the impact they had within their region. At the same time, they wanted to account for loss of sales from other industry players, and they did see I wouldn't say significant loss, but a loss. It is a competitive environment. It's one that, in fact, for many private distributors and private food hubs is a contentious point, which we've seen a lot on the community of practice, to the extent that a nonprofit food hub enters a for-profit space and undersells the market in order to get part of that market share could be problematic. But at the same time, it depends on what they're selling and to whom and how well those consumers are served. Because at the end of the day, whether you're a broadline, multi-billion-dollar distributor or a $100,000 nonprofit food hub, who is the consumer responding to, and are you meeting the needs of that consumer? And that's kind of the bottom line.
And a great place to stop. Thank you. There are many, many more questions, and I'm hoping that we can post some answers. And some of your excellent questions will be answered once you get to see the written version of this. Of course, this is the hour-long version. The written will dive a little bit into a bit more detail. So I want to thank both of the gyms. This piece of work, coupled with the Food Hub benchmark study that was mentioned, and the 2013 and in process 2015 Food Hub Collaboration National Food Hub Survey with Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems, paint a more and more clear picture about what it takes to run a viable food hub. I know you all joined me in anticipation of the full report. I did have that survey up there, or the poll up there, so anyone who answered yes, I would like to be notified will be, which is great. This webinar is recorded and will be archived at our website, ngfn.org/webinars. We'll take you right there, along with the over 60 other webinars we've done in the past. Feel free to send others who do you think would like to have heard this presentation, and take some professional development time yourself and dig through our excellent archives. They are organized by topic in the left-hand navigation area, and we'll have this up within the next couple business days. We offer the NGFN webinars on the third Thursday of each month at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Sign-up links are always at ngfn.org/webinars and will be emailed to you if you get on our mailing list. In April, we hear from 4 farmers to tell us their experience as selling to the food hubs. So this is the production side. Why do they sell to the hub? What are the best and worst parts of selling through a hub? How are they managing their risk? What are the demands the hubs put on them? How has it changed their business? Our focal audience here really is farmers who are considering entering the hub market and want to hear from their peers, but of course also farmer support groups. In May, we dig deep into crop insurance, particularly the new products that are available from USDA and other whole farm insurance plans. These options better cater to the smaller diversified farmer rather than individual crop insurance policies. Learn what's out there, how to choose which, if any product will work for your operation or the operations of those farmers that you support. And in June, I think many of you will be interested in this particular one. We dig into access to capital. So food hub, processor, farmer, institutional buyer, access to capital to ensure business viability and growth is often very difficult, something mentioned often in this webinar. Michael Schumann will present several innovative sources for capital, some that didn't even exist until recently. So this one is a must-see. And there will be an option to automatically sign up for any and all of these webinars in the post-webinar survey, so make sure you fill it out. The Michigan State University, this was mentioned before, in concert with Wallace Center and the National Good Food Network Food Hub Collaboration, including USDA and Farm Credit, is currently running the 2015 National Food Hub Survey. We ran a similar survey in 2013 and have leveraged the data collected from that survey to open up new interest and new funding streams for food hubs. As the second time we're running the survey, we'll have the opportunity to look at how operations change over time, some longitudinal data. Very, very useful as we continue to build out this sector. If you are a food hub, please take the time to participate. I know that you all are busy, too few people to run your hubs, but please do take the time to participate. It'll take about an hour and a half. Please contact Jill Hardy directly. You can get your personalized link, particularly if you've filled out the survey in the last time. But we also have a question in the post-webinar survey just to indicate that you'd like more information. Agricultural Marketing Service, who has for years maintained a farmer's market directory has now added an on-farm market directory, a CSA directory, and most relevant for this crowd, a food hub directory. If you or people you work with are involved in any of these activities, please visit USDA food directories, localfooddirectories.com, and enter your information. That website is here, and that bit.ly link in the bottom goes directly to the entering your information for the food hub. You can find the NGFN on YouTube, on Twitter, and on our website, ngfn.org. The Wallace Center is also on Facebook. Come like us, search for Wallace Center at WinRaft International. And if you haven't already, sign up for our email updates. There's a link on the ngfn.org homepage, or just let us know in that post-webinar survey, and we will sign you up. Contact us at any time. Email address is contact@ngfn.org, right at the bottom there. The NGFN would like to thank Jim Matson, Jim Barham, and you all for your time today. Once again, let me encourage you to fill out that survey that will open in your web browser in just a moment. Thank you. This concludes the webinar.